The year is 1943. The location, the pitch-black skies above the Caucasus Mountains on the Eastern Front. Below, the German 4th Air Army is dug in. Their soldiers are exhausted, huddled in trenches, trying to steal a few hours of sleep before the freezing dawn brings another wave of Soviet artillery. But sleep is a luxury they cannot afford. The night is silent. There is no roar of heavy engines, no sirens, just the biting wind whipping through the valleys. Then they hear it. It's a soft, rushing sound, a rhythmic, whistling whoosh. It sounds less like a machine and more like heavy fabric tearing through the air, or a broomstick sweeping the sky. Before the German anti-aircraft gunners can even scramble to their posts, the darkness erupts. Flares ignite the snow-covered ground. Small bombs shatter the supply depots and tear through the tents. By the time the searchlights sweep the clouds, the attackers are gone. They have vanished into the ether, their engines only sputtering back to life once they are miles away in the safety of the dark. The German soldiers on the ground have a name for these invisible tormentors. They call them Nachthexen, the night witches. Rumours spread through the German ranks that these pilots have been given special injections that give them night vision like cats. They believe they are fighting supernatural beings. But the truth was far more extraordinary than the rumours. The pilots weren't genetically modified super soldiers. They weren't flying advanced stealth technology. They were flying crop dusters made of plywood and canvas. They had no parachutes, no radios, and no radar. And they were all women. To understand how a group of young women, many just out of high school, ended up terrorizing the Wehrmacht, we have to look at the desperate state of the Soviet Union in 1941. In June of that year, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest land invasion in human history. 3 million Axis troops surged across the border, tearing the Red Army to pieces. By autumn, the Germans were at the gates of Moscow. The Soviet Air Force had been decimated, most of it destroyed on the ground in the first week of the war. The USSR was facing annihilation. They needed every able-bodied person to fight. They needed pilots. Enter Marina Raskova. Raskova was already a celebrity. In the 1930s, she was the Soviet Amelia Earhart, a famous navigator who set long-distance flight records. She received letters by the sackful from young women across the Soviet Union who wanted to fly, to fight, to help their country. But the military establishment was rigid. Women could support, they could nurse, they could dig anti-tank ditches, but they were not combat pilots. Raskova used her personal influence to change that. She went straight to the top. She petitioned Joseph Stalin personally. The logic was grim, but undeniable. The motherland was burning. Why leave half the population out of the cockpit? In October 1941, Stalin granted the order to form Aviation Group 122, 3 regiments of all-female pilots. The 586 Fighter Regiment, the 587 Dive Bomber Regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Thousands of volunteers flooded in. They were students, factory workers, teachers and clerks. Some were as young as 17. They arrived at the Engels Aviation School expecting glory. What they got was a harsh reality check. The military wasn't ready for them, literally. When the women arrived at the training base, there were no uniforms designed for the female form. They were issued men's tunics that hung down to their knees and boots, so large they had to stuff them with rags and bedding just to walk without tripping. They had their hair cut short. They were drilled until they collapsed. And they had to learn in a few months what usually took years. But the biggest shock came when the 588th Regiment saw the planes they were destined to fly. They were Polikarpov Po-2s. Even in 1942, the Po-2 was a relic. Designed in the late 1920s as a training plane and crop duster, it was made of wood and canvas. It had an open cockpit, leaving the pilots exposed to the freezing Russian elements. It was slow, agonizingly slow. Its top speed was roughly 90 miles per hour, slower than most cars on a modern highway, and certainly slower than the stall speed of the profound German Messerschmitt fighters. It carried no armor. A single tracer bullet could ignite the canvas skin like a dry leaf. It had no radio. Pilots communicated by shouting over the wind or waggling their wings. It had no gun sights. They aimed by drawing lines in lipstick on the windshield or simply by eyesight and intuition. To the male pilots flying the sleek Yak fighters or the heavily armoured Il-2 Sturmovix, the 588 was a joke. They called the Po-2 a sewing machine. They mocked the women, calling them dolls or skirted soldiers. But the women of the 588th saw something else. They saw an opportunity. The Po-2 had one critical advantage: maneuverability. Because it flew so slowly and so low to the ground, it could hug the treetops. It could turn on a dime. And because its engine was so primitive, it was quieter than the heavy bombers. They realized that if they couldn't outrun the enemy, they would have to outsmart them. In June 1942, the 588th deployed to the southern front. The fighting was vicious. The Germans were pushing toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad. The regiment developed a tactic born of necessity and suicidal bravery. They flew only at night. They flew in formations of 3. As they approached the target, a German encampment, a supply train, a fuel depot, the 2 lead planes would break off and rev their engines loudly. They were the bait. Their job was to draw the searchlights and the anti-aircraft fire. While the German gunners were distracted, tracking the noise, the 3rd plane would climb, cut its engine, and glide. Silence. The pilot would drift through the darkness, invisible. The only sound was the wind rushing over the canvas wings, that whooshing broomstick noise that terrified the soldiers below. At the last second, the pilot would pull the release. The bombs weren't huge. The plane couldn't carry heavy ordnance, but they were deadly accurate. After the drop, the pilot would restart the engine, hoping it didn't stall in the cold, and scramble away while the other 2 planes took their turn. It was psychological warfare as much as physical. The Germans couldn't sleep. They couldn't light fires to keep warm. They were constantly scanning the sky for the witches. General Major Bershanskaya, the regimental commander, ran a tight ship. But the operational tempo was grueling. Because the Po-2 could only carry 2 bombs at a time, the pilots had to return to base, reload, refuel, and go back out, again, and again, and again. To understand the human cost of these missions, look at the story of Nadezhda Popova. Popova was a daring, charismatic pilot who would become one of the most celebrated figures of the regiment. She recounted nights that seem physically impossible to the modern mind. On one particularly intense night in Poland, Popova flew 18 sorties. 18 times taking off into the darkness. 18 times dodging flak. 18 times landing on a makeshift runway lit only by kerosene lamps. By the end of the night, she was so exhausted she had to be lifted out of the cockpit. Her hands were frozen into the shape of the control stick. The cold was a constant enemy. The open cockpits meant frostbite was guaranteed. The women would grease their faces with animal fat to prevent their skin from freezing and cracking in the wind. And for the first few years of the war, they flew without parachutes. This wasn't an oversight. It was a calculation. The Po-2 was underpowered. A parachute added weight. Weight meant fewer bombs. So they left the parachutes behind. If your canvas plane caught fire, and they often did, burning like matchsticks, you had 2 choices: burn with the plane, or jump to your death. Popova lost friends. They all did. One night, the Germans brought in a new weapon, a night fighter equipped with radar. In a single engagement, the regiment lost 4 planes. 8 women burned alive in mid-air. Popova watched them fall. She saw the flames streak down the sky. and then she taxied to the runway and took off for her next mission. Despite the mockery they faced early on, the 588th eventually silenced their critics. They didn't just bomb targets, they supplied encircled Soviet troops, dropping food and ammunition at treetop level. The male pilots who had laughed at the skirted soldiers began to watch in awe. The 588th was so effective that the Germans awarded an Iron Cross to any soldier who managed to shoot one down. In 1943, in recognition of their courage, the unit was honoured with the Guards designation. They became the 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. They were the first all-female unit to receive such an honour. They fought from the Caucasus, through the Crimea, across Belarus and Poland, and finally, into the heart of the Third Reich. By 1945, they were flying over Germany. Imagine the scene. The same plywood biplanes that had struggled to rise above the Russian mud were now casting their shadows over the ruins of Berlin. They had flown the full distance of the war. When the war ended in May 1945, the statistics of the Night Witches were staggering. They had flown over 30,000 missions. They had dropped 23,000 tons of bombs. 23 of their pilots were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honour. But victory came with a bitter aftertaste. The war ended, the parades began. In the massive victory parade in Moscow, tanks rolled through Red Square. Elite infantry units marched in lockstep. The sky roared with modern fighters, but the Night Witches were missing. The official reason? Their planes were too slow and unimpressive for the grand spectacle. Some sources suggest the women were told their marching wasn't up to the standard of the drill teams. After risking their lives for 4 years, after freezing in open cockpits and outsmarting the Luftwaffe, they were told to go home. The Soviet Union, for all its talk of equality, quickly reverted to traditional gender roles. The women were encouraged to return to civilian life, to become mothers and wives, and to leave the war stories to the men. Marina Raskova, the founder, never saw the victory. She died in a crash in 1943, receiving the first state funeral of the war. For decades, the story of the Night Witches was largely known only within the USSR, and even there, it was often overshadowed by the male-dominated narratives of the Great Patriotic War. It wasn't until much later, as the veterans began to write their memoirs and historians like Nadezhda Popova spoke out, that the world truly understood what they had achieved. The story of the Night Witches is not just a story about World War II. It is a story about the intersection of desperation and ingenuity. It challenges our perception of what a soldier looks like. It reminds us that when pushed to the brink of survival, ordinary people, regardless of gender, are capable of extraordinary resilience. They took a crop duster, a machine meant for peace, and turned it into a weapon of psychological terror. They took the prejudice of their enemies and their own commanders and used it as fuel. They flew in the dark so that others could see the dawn. Most of the Night Witches are gone now. Nadezhda Popova passed away in 2013. But the sound of the wind rushing over canvas, the whoosh of the witch's broom, that echoes forever in the halls of history. This was the story of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. History is full of units like this, people who fought on the forgotten front lines, whose stories were buried by time or politics. If you want to help us uncover more of these faded conflicts, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments, what other forgotten unit should we cover next? Until next time.